I just wanted to let you know before we start that for the Q&A section at the end of our speaker's intervention, we're going to be scrolling through the questions that you sent, and we're actually going to be grouping them into subject matter because sometimes the questions repeat themselves. And what we're trying to do is, time permitting, have the opportunity to ask them about 6 questions or something like that, that will be grouped from the feedback that we get from you. And so we ask that you continue sending your questions. They are very important to us and to the dynamic that we're having today. And I will do my best to relay them to our panel and have them answer whatever questions you may have. So with this, you can start.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's great. Okay, what is the well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here with all of you, and let me offer congratulations on your initiative in forming this alliance. I think it will be of real importance to Venezuela and to the policy-making process in the United States. Very much looking forward to having a dialogue with all of you. I'll try to keep my comments to a minimum. And I look forward then to your questions and comments. And I'm very much looking forward to an exchange. And I'll thank Rocio in advance for screening out the hard questions. I think it's important for the American, a non-Venezuelan American, I think I am, to have a dose of humility when we talk about Venezuela. And for 2 reasons. First, because we're Americans. I'm an outsider when it comes to Venezuela. But second, so many of us have worked on the issue of Venezuela for many years from different vantage points, trying to support a democratic transition. And the fact is, we've not been successful. Lots of different things have been tried by different administrations, by other different actors. And the fact is, we've all failed. So I think it's important for all of us to be open to different views, different approaches. I can begin with just a little bit of my background with regard to Venezuela. I've been doing polling there. I'm also a pollster in addition to some of the things that Jose noted. I've been doing polling in Venezuela since 2003, initially for RCTV and Mossack, and then for various opposition political parties, various private sector groups, and I would use that research to help develop political and communications strategies. And I've done some recent polling as well in Venezuela in 2018 and 2019. Also just did a poll for a foundation in New York of Venezuelan refugees in Peru and Colombia. And the idea there was to understand their needs and their expectations and their plans to try to motivate the private sector to provide additional support to Venezuelan refugees. In the Obama administration, as noted, I had a couple positions. I headed up initially the Latin American Bureau at the U.S. Agency for International Development and oversaw assistance to the Western Hemisphere and assistance to Venezuela. At the time, we had a $5 million budget to provide support to Venezuelan civil society and private funding to IRI as well. And then I had 2 years at the National Security Council, last 2 years of the administration, as Senior Director of Western Hemisphere Affairs of President Obama's Chief Latin American Advisor. And I spent more time on Venezuela on a sustained basis than any other issue, in part because it was obviously important to the United States, but also due to the personal passion that I had for the issue. And I wrote more memos on Venezuela for President Obama than any other issue, and that was his request. You're all coming to D.C., as you know, during an historic time. There are impeachment hearings going on somewhere on Capitol Hill. You're probably thinking to yourselves, I could be watching these historic hearings instead of sitting here listening to Mark Feierstein. I feel your pain. I'd rather be watching the hearings than listen to Mark Feierstein as well. So we'll try to talk fast so you can get back to the hearings. But Washington is obviously very divided now, but we still come together on certain issues, and I think Venezuela is clearly one of those issues. all of us, Democrats, Republicans, agree on the nature of the Maduro regime. We don't need to debate that at all. I, for example, support Joe Biden. You may have seen there was a list published yesterday of about 130 national security professionals who endorsed him for president. I was one of the signers. But that said, I agree with much of what the Trump administration has done with regard to Venezuela. And there might be some disagreement between Democrats, Republicans, or even within the Republican Party, with the Democratic Party on what the right approach is, how to apply pressure, what's the appropriate role of diplomacy, what role, if any, there should be use of force. Those are really just tactical questions. And again, I come back to my point about humility. None of us can claim to have the magic answer, because if it were that easy to solve, the situation would have been solved a while ago. Now, though I left the NSC just less than 3 years ago, things have obviously changed dramatically in Venezuela since then. I think it's helpful just to review quickly where things were a few years ago when I was at the White House. And you think back in 2015, 2016, the opposition strategy was election-based. 2015 was all about the National Assembly elections, and then 2016 was a recall effort. And what I tried to do was ensure U.S. support and regional support for both of those processes. I was actually ridiculed at one point at the White House for my support of the National Assembly process. And one of my bosses at the time, the Deputy National Security Advisor, called me into her office and said, why are you the only one who believes that the opposition can actually win these elections? As you know, the opposition won a supermajority in December of 2015. Now, to be sure, the Assembly was then shut down, but the basis of Juan Guaido's authority today comes from those elections. So it was important for the opposition to participate in that and do as well as they did. Now, the economy back then was pretty bad, and I used to say, one of my talking points was, if Venezuela has the highest inflation rate in the world, it is 100%. And that's what it was back in 2015, 2016. It was outrageous, 100% inflation. And no one could imagine where it would go from there. At the time, migration crisis was just beginning, and the view from Colombia was, look, they can handle it. You went up, they can handle it. Again, no one could imagine the numbers that would occur in the coming years. And the international panorama, the regional panorama, I think it's important to keep in mind, was very different then as well. As a result of Venezuela not being seen as the crisis it is today back then, and the composition of regional governments, it was very hard to get any sort of regional action. And keep in mind, when I started the White House in 2015, we had Cristina in Argentina, Dilma in Brazil, Humala was still in Peru, Santos obviously was focused on the peace process in Colombia. And when President Obama sanctioned 7 officials in, I guess it was April of 2015, there was an uproar in the region. Opposing the sanctions, which is hard to believe. That was just 4 years ago. I'd also add that Russia was not the actor then that it is today. Now, obviously, much has changed in the last 3 years. The opposition strategy, of course, is very different. The economy is so much worse. Migration, obviously. There's significant support for Juan Guaido, significant international pressure on Nicolás Maduro. And Russia, I think, frankly, is an actor, a major actor, in a way that it was not just a few years ago, and that's really helping to sustain Maduro. So all in all, as you all know better than I, Venezuela is worse off today than it was 3 years ago. Venezuelans are worse off today than they were 3 years ago. I just want to offer a few thoughts on what a potential resolution of the conflict might look like, and potential alternatives for U.S. policy. I'll begin with my bottom line, which I think the approach most likely to succeed, not likely, but most likely to succeed, will be continued pressure in the form of sanctions and some sort of negotiations, perhaps, via the Oslo process. I'm not saying I'm optimistic about that necessarily, but look at all the potential options out there. I think that is the best option. Now, and I understand the concerns with regard to negotiations and dialogue and all the failures in 2015, 2016, 2017. The fact that the government stalled, frankly, used the talks to consolidate power, recognize all that. But I think there are at least three important differences now compared to the earlier attempts. One is the opposition is much stronger now than it was a few years ago, with one right now recognized by 50 countries. Two, there's significant international pressure that didn't exist before in the form of targeted sanctions, in the form of broader sanctions. There's much more diplomatic isolation of the regime. And then finally, there's a different set of negotiators. I think the Norwegians are pretty skillful and very experienced. I would not say the same about Zapatero and Fernandez and Martin Corrillos, all due respect to all of them. But I think Zapatero, frankly, was biased, and that was a process that was destined to fail because of the makeup of negotiators, and also because of the lack of pressure on the regime at that time. So, I mean, the big question now is the nature of the pressure that we should be applying. And there's a clear consensus with regard to the targeted sanctions, the sanctions on regime officials. And the goal of this administration, which I think was similar to what we were trying to at the NSC and during the Obama administration, is create fissures within the regime, and try to get people to break off from Maduro. And plus, I think there's a view that people should not have access to the U.S. financial system, and they should be able to travel here if they're engaging in acts of corruption and human rights abuses. I think there is a legitimate debate, nevertheless, over the broader sanctions, or the economic sanctions. And I think there is evidence that the sanctions are hurting Venezuelans arguably more than it's hurting the regime. I'm not suggesting the sanctions are responsible for the economic crisis, they're not. That's minority. But clearly the sanctions are making things worse. I think the question is, how long can we sustain them if we don't achieve our objective of removing Maduro from office and advancing a democratic transition? And I think if continued economic deprivation of sanctions contribute to more migration, frankly, I think that helps Maduro. I think it relieves pressure on him with opponents leaving the country. And I think it makes things more difficult for neighboring countries. I do think, whatever your view is on those sanctions, I think that's a debate I think it's something you just need to think about as you approach your messaging, is what they were saying for the next couple days. But also, I look at my polling on this. Venezuelan people are strongly supportive of targeted sanctions. They're much less supportive of the broader sanctions. Now, the Trump administration likes to talk about maximum pressure. Frankly, I think the administration sometimes gives the impression their policy is pressure for pressure's sake. Maybe that's just a challenge. Sometimes I wonder, it's not clear to me at least, how the pressure is going to lead to a transition in legitimate elections, sort of what's the mechanism by which we're going to achieve that transition. I think it's better to think about calibrated pressure. We want to target the right people. We want to target those who are going to respond in the way that we want them to respond. We want to avoid sort of rallying around the fact in which sanctions become counterproductive and may keep people less likely to take desired action. I think we want to be able to ratchet up pressure as needed. I think most important, we want to give people an out, some sort of an exit. And that's where I think the toughest questions come in. How much do you compromise with corrupt venal officials? And with whom do you compromise? Do you provide amnesty or not? Do you lift sanctions on officials? Do you allow some officials to participate in politics? Ultimately, these are questions that you, the Venezuelan people, have to resolve. There are plenty of international examples to draw on in this region, from transitions in Chile, transitions in Nicaragua, and other countries. There are obviously the South Africa example. There are contemporary examples now in Zimbabwe and Sudan. There are no right or wrong answers. These are just really, really hard questions. But ultimately, even though these are obviously questions that you'll need to resolve, the Venezuelan people need to resolve, the Venezuelan leadership, the opposition leadership, you'll need the international backing as well when it comes to sanctions and prosecutions and such. I think one thing worrying Maduro officials is that amnesties are not lifetime guarantees. We've seen plenty of cases, and I think this is a good thing, where amnesties have been reversed. We've seen Argentina, for example, Chile, and elsewhere. But it's harder if you're trying to get officials out of office. And we also have an international criminal court, which is not necessarily going to refrain from going after corrupt officials and going after officials who committed crimes against humanity. I think there's also a guarantee, a little bit more amorphous, that needs to be provided, which is a commitment to reconciliation. and a recognition that there is a role for all Venezuelans, for Chavistas as well, in any future Venezuelan democracy. I think President Biden recognizes that. I know Elliott Abrams has spoken to this specifically in a speech he gave a few months ago at Atlantic Council. My polling shows that the opposition, you can win an election by rejecting Chavismo, but you can't govern without the Chavistas. And I think it's an important difference. Another complication to resolution of the crisis, of course, are the various international actors I referenced. You've got obviously Cuba, China, Russia, all playing exceedingly unhelpful roles. You're familiar with all that. But frankly, it's hard for me to see a negotiated solution that does not involve those countries in some way. It would be nice if we could achieve a resolution without having to engage with them, but I just don't see that necessarily happening under the current circumstances. And to me, arguably the most important question is whether international pressure is enough. Can it succeed without domestic pressure? I'm not so sure. And frankly, I think that's the biggest factor that's lacking now. It's questionable whether Maduro and his allies are really feeling domestic pressure. And I understand why it's so difficult to take to the streets and to protest. I know there's going to be another attempt next week. Venezuelan people are exhausted, they're hungry, they're tired, they'll spend their days looking for food and medicine. They're afraid because of repressive security apparatus. People have been tortured, so I'm not criticizing by any means a decision by many Venezuelans not to take to the streets. But I think without that, this effort becomes that much more difficult. And finally, related to that is the notion that all options are on the table. As Donald Trump likes to say, all options are not on the table. There's no serious military option that's being considered by the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. And I think it's frankly a mistake to talk as if there is. I think it's a bluff. It's not credible. And I think it matters because it gives an impression to the Venezuelan people and some of the opposition political leadership that some outside force is going to come in and save them or save you. And that's not going to happen. And the U.S. is prepared, must be prepared to support your efforts, but ultimately you must be in the lead. So I look forward to your questions and your comments, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Good afternoon. My name is Dan Fisk. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And also pass along my thanks to each of you for your commitment to Venezuelan democracy. It's really important that you're here and your voices are being heard. Let me add this this preface, since I'm kind of here in a couple of roles, but what you're going to hear from me are just Fisk's views, my own views, some of which will overlap with Mark's, and just kind of confirming that there is a bipartisan analysis on Venezuela, maybe some nuances in some areas, but it is important that this is approached on a bipartisan basis. I give high marks, relatively high marks to the Trump administration for the actions it's taken, and for the fact also high marks to Congress for having also kind of stood firmly behind democracy and in Venezuela. Kind of from a former policymaker's position, I keep two things in mind. First, there's actually a lot more that's probably happening behind the scenes than Elliott Abrams was able to convey to you today, or Marshall Billingsley, or that any of us have visibility on when you're not in the sausage-making factory that is the policy institutions. Second, that policy options are really nice as an academic discussion. They're rarely ideal for the situation at hand. They're rarely as malleable as any policymaker would like them to be, or any of us in this room would like them to be. And it's also a matter that quite often, along with limitations, implementation comes with the great potential for unintended consequences. This in no way is to step back from the various options that are out there. It's just to kind of frame the discussion, something Mark and I, and actually Jose and others, have struggled with in various capacities over the years. And looking at the administration's policy, again, from an outside perspective, frankly, I see them since April 30th in what I'll call a more of the same approach. It's more sanctions, it's more diplomacy, especially around support for Juan Guaido and the interim government. It's more humanitarian assistance. It is kind of more of the same, with the same objective in mind, but at this point not really sure what additional steps may make a difference. I find it ironic that we are now in the 11th month of a situation which there are now parallel structures in Venezuela. From a U.S. perspective, there are parallel governing structures, which we recognize. One, the interim government is the legitimate one, and the Maduro dictatorship as the illegitimate, as an illegitimate entity, but nonetheless, it's still there. It's operating in Venezuela. It's also interesting to me that there is general agreement across the political spectrum in the U.S. and I think across the aisle in Congress that this status quo is not sustainable. I want to now pivot a little bit to 2020. Mark talked a bit the kind of where we've come from. I see next year as a pivotal year. First of all, we have the situation that, as I understand the Venezuelan Constitution, you are President of the National Assembly for a year. So we're going to approach that 1-year mark with Juan Guaido as head of the National Assembly and by extension as interim president. I understand the National Assembly has authority to adjust that, but I do think it's going to be an interesting moment, and then, kind of what does that mean for the coalition that the interim government represents. The other item on the agenda for 2020, per the existing Constitution, are there's supposed to be National Assembly elections. I think it's a serious question. Can they be conducted? How would they even be conducted? Who's going to preside? What is the mechanism? What happens in that case to the mandate of the National Assembly, the existing National Assembly, should that date come and go? The humanitarian situation is one that we all in this room are very much aware of. It's been mostly focused on migration. I tend to take estimates and actually increase the numbers. My experience over time is numbers tend to be undercounted, but nonetheless, we're still talking 4.5 to 5 million Venezuelans who left the country, and it is entirely foreseeable that another million could leave over the next year. I'll put it this way, this is the Cuban model, which is you let people leave, you don't keep them in. And that, too, I believe that out-migration is actually worse than the Maduro dictatorship's advantage. Mark made some reference to this. I mean, malnutrition is the threat. It exists, but the threat of that increasing is significant. There's a new Food and Agriculture Organization report talking about the number of Venezuelans that may be affected by severe malnutrition in the coming months. Then you have the impact in the region as we end 2019 and enter 2020. A new government in Argentina. Not only what does that mean for the Argentines, but what does it mean for the region and things like the Lima Group. The situation in Chile, to what extent are the Chileans now distracted from any larger role in the region. The situation in Bolivia, we'll hear more about that. What are the potential repercussions, if any? And so I think that this is kind of, again, it's an interesting moment that we are entering. We're also living in an interesting moment. I would offer this, since, as I understand, you all are going to be interacting with members of Congress in the coming hours and day this week, and it's a couple things I would just offer. Clearly, you want to convey your views to them, your assessment. You want to hear their assessment. But one of the things that is most useful when you're in the policymaking side, elected or non-elected, is actually having something concrete to focus on. So I would encourage some specifics in terms of your messaging. not just we have to do something about Venezuela. It's a matter of kind of thinking through what that would be. I'll offer some suggestions from my perspective on this. And some of these are very obvious, and you're going to go, well, so what? But actually, it's good sometimes to reinforce this. One, Guaido and the National Assembly are the constitutional government of Venezuela, and they need to continue to understand that they have firm U.S. support from both the executive branch and the Congress, from the two political branches of this government. That is a most powerful message. There should be no confusion in the mind of Venezuelans, in the minds of others in the region, in the minds of external actors, that the U.S. government is unified as far as who is the legitimate authority in Venezuela and what the evolution of that country should be. With that is also, I think, a message to the various constituent parts of the interim government, to the National Assembly. They have to stay unified. I think everyone in this room can probably convey some anecdote that talks about some of the underlying currents amongst the group of individuals and political philosophies. But it is, I think, critical that they understand that external observers who support them also reinforce the idea of unity. It's also a matter of resources. And this is a case of assistance which can take various forms. But right now, the Trump administration, with congressional support, is on track to provide some significant resources through a number of implementers and including directly to the interim government. And I think that's an important part of this. Sanctions continue to be, I think, an important tool. They also continue to be an important message. I have a simple rule on sanctions. Sanctions don't work until they do. And so the fact of the matter is that one has to keep in mind that there is the symbolic value to sanctions. There is also the leverage that they do affect, and the pain they do inflict on the individuals who have been targeted. And targeted sanctions, I think what we have seen have had a positive role in terms of trying to create some space for the internal opposition. For the interim government and the domestic and the democratic forces in Venezuela. It's also a matter that with those needs to come messaging, I think, to the Venezuelan military. Again, we'll hear about Bolivia, but the Bolivian situation and the Venezuelan situation are not, from where I sit in my analysis, identical as far as where the military and kind of the coercive instruments of the state are in that. The other thing we need to do is avoid what I call the dialogue trap. We always have to be open to dialogue, but at this point the record is not a good one in terms of who benefits from it. It's been the Chavistas, Maduro, that have benefited. I will take this a little bit different from Mark. We do have to maintain the credibility of all options are on the table. I know that there is a risk of that coming off as bluster. It also is going to be dependent upon, frankly, the personality of the president. George W. Bush was treated differently than Barack Obama when they each made noises in terms about the use of some coercive instrument or force. I think that is the case with President Trump. People are trying to figure out what he really means. The administration needs to work in terms of kind of how do you maintain that as the best you can as a real threat, recognizing that it can create false expectations that we are going to solve the situation in Venezuela. There are some things that can be looked at, multinational exercises, for one, military exercises, what I'm talking about. And then also, given that we're frankly dealing with a criminal enterprise, that it was basically the Maduro apparatus, a lot more aggressive law enforcement, not just by U.S. law enforcement agencies, but also looking at those international instruments that are out there. Another piece I would put out there is it's about Venezuela, but the neighborhood is very important in bolstering Colombia. This is a time when there should be no stepping back from the United States support to Colombia. We have a lot of interest in Colombia. In some cases, they're competing with our interests vis-a-vis Venezuela, but nonetheless, the importance of Colombia, not only as, frankly, a democratic model and an economic success to juxtapose against Venezuela, but also simply the fact that in terms of migration, the impact in the region overall. Working with the Lima Group continues to be a challenge. It's going to get, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to get a little harder to navigate. I think with Argentina, the change there, but I could still see that as essential. And we still have to keep in mind of the OAS. If you're looking at something in the region, to me, it's really about the OAS more than the UN. Finally, I would say to members of Congress, when they're interacting with representatives of one of the 55, roughly, I think it's 55% governments, their ambassadors are on the Hill all the time, they're interacting with those ambassadors. That ambassador represents a country that has recognized Juan Guaido, the interim government, and reinforced that positive nature of it, that's been taken into account. I mean, that's an easy kind of give, if you will. It's all of a sudden, it adds to the conversation. I mean, it's a matter of kind of also reminding them that Venezuela is important in terms of how we look at the bilateral relationship with that third country. To that extent, the EU extension of sanctions is another thing. So when dealing with European Union member countries, acknowledging that. And finally, on humanitarian aid, I guess I will end on this, is that, it is a matter of continuing that assistance, but I would also posit that it's time to think far more aggressively about how do we handle humanitarian assistance other than just parking lots of aid at the border. And so there, I think Congress has a role to play in that discussion. And should there be this concept of actually humanitarian aid zones in Venezuela under the auspices of the constitutional government of Juan Guaido, that would be multinational in their composition, but actually a matter of getting aid in the country. From what I can tell right now, when you park aid on the border, it becomes an incentive to leave the country. Some aid is getting into the country. We understand that anecdotally, but the larger incentive is to get out of the country. And that, again, I think Mark and I agree on that in the sense that out-migration helps the Maduro dictatorship. Going back to one of my points about 2020 and what happens next year, I do see Venezuela at this far more significant moment in terms of which direction it goes. Does next year become really the path to a democratic Venezuela, or do we really see the consolidation of a Cubanized Venezuela? Because the regime itself, Maduro regime, cannot allow the continuation of this parallel structure in the one that we recognize as the legitimate government. This makes it all the more important, the timing of your visit, the messages that you convey, and it reinforces, hopefully, for all of you that you made a really good decision not to watch impeachment hearings, but to come here and talk about freedom in Venezuela. So.
Okay, it's on? Okay, perfect. First let me tell you something. I was not expecting, as a Bolivian, to be talking to you about the subject I'm going to tell you about. Because during the last 72 hours, I have barely slept, and I could barely believe what the outcome of certain events have actually spelled. I worked as the Director of Research for the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba. I do a lot of research about CTOC, countering transnational organized crime and counterterrorism. And I'm a Bolivian, so basically you can already guess that I'm pretty busy these days. One of the things I'm going to be talking to you about is this book. But I want to put this in context of the recent news that we have been getting from Bolivia. And the first sentence that comes to my mind is this phrase that says, "Beware of the silent man." In this case, I think this is something that this pink tide that produced all the Bolivarian governments, the so-called Foro de Sao Paulo, never expected what happened in Bolivia. For quite some time, I have tried to explain to a lot of friends in Europe, the U.S., even in other countries in Latin America, that this small country, and I'm not talking in terms of geography, it's 1,000,098 square kilometers, so it's pretty big in terms of land, but we're just 11 million. So this small country have some very specific traits due to a very I would say, interesting history. We are the country with the most coup d'etat in the history of mankind. We are one of the countries with more revolutions in the history of mankind. We are the only country that have had basically 5 presidents in a single day. So we do have certain things, but the social dynamics of Bolivia tend to be, due to this, the actions of highly politically educated people. And we usually solve conflicts in a very rapid and very violent fashion that sometimes shocks visitors and, of course, observers. What happened in Bolivia is also that a lot of the things that later on affect the region and sometimes have global outreach are produced in this small country. So again, be aware of this small country because, for example, sociologists and historians, they agree that the 3 more relevant revolutions in the history of the Americas are the 1910 revolution in Mexico, the 1952 revolution in Bolivia, and the Cuban Revolution. But out of those 3, only the Bolivian Revolution produced real structural change for a society who came from basically feudalism to the modern era in a matter of less than 5 years. Universal voting rights, equal civil rights, an agricultural reform that to this day is a challenge for more developed countries like Argentina or Brazil happened in Bolivia in just 2 years. So again, it's a very interesting country from a lot of perspectives. And right now, we have shocked the world one more time because the last time we produced was a very dangerous type of organization. Mr. Morales' organization, because everybody talks about ego and forgets where ego comes from. Ego is the offspring of a very, very dangerous model, which is the combination of, in Marxist-Leninism, is defined as all forms of struggle. What the Confederación de Cocaleros, the Bolivian Cocalero organization, managed to achieve was a hybrid of political action, social movement, and criminal activity, all in one. And sadly, this model has been already replicated because it's been understood by probably the worst actors that could have learned from this model. One of them is Cuba, the other one is the Chavista regime. The FARC did the same. If you can analyze under this perspective what happened with the Proceso de Paz, you're going to see that the Colombian FARC followed the blueprint of what Raúl Reyes already called the Bolivian model. So they created a political party, they assigned a quote-unquote dissidencia to take care of the logistical base, to be specific to drug trafficking, and at the same time they started exacerbating conflict. And the result is the conflict and the instability that you see in the region. Probably you're going to recognize a lot of this in what you are experiencing in Venezuela. It's basically what the PSUV and the colectivos learn to do, and then very fast. And this is something that also have been very well understood by extra-regional actors. It's for me very concerning to read some analysis penned by Sergei Shoigu, current Minister of Defense of Russia, and he talks about this. He calls this the new war, or the new doctrine of the Army of the Popular Republic of China, where they call this model social war. It's very interesting. Now, what happened in Bolivia? And this is also brand new. It's a grassroots movement where the political parties played no role. The military only came at the very end of the whole process. A country that during 21 days was able to basically stop every single movement in each one of the capital cities in the country without violence. Not a single act of vandalism, not one riot. All the violence came from Mr. Morales' organization. All the dead are actually citizens that were peacefully blocking and were not rioting, were not looting, were not causing any kind of violence. And this new type of movement caught Morales and the extra-regional and regional actors present in Bolivia completely off balance. Because all of a sudden violence was met with a void space. There was not a reaction, there were no confrontations, and something that's very important, Bolivians learned in 2009 that they couldn't count with the international community. Because a similar movement happened in 2008. And due to the very, very nimble and very efficient propaganda machine that connects all the actors related to this movement, we were labeled as CIA agents, as people who was trying a coup d'etat, people that were racist, oligarchs, and basically all the bad things that you can think about a human being. How do I know that? I was one of them. So after 11 years on exile, it was very shocking and at the same time interesting for me to see how every single thing that Bolivians were doing was not subject to any kind of conditioning from the international perspective, nor positive nor negative. And one last thing, every single thing was done as per the constitution that Evo Morales himself had approved. So there couldn't be any observations, even from the legal standpoint. So again, this model was not ready for this. It was not ready for a grassroots movement composed by citizens who wouldn't negotiate. They wouldn't negotiate at any given point. And by the way, I'm not criticizing political parties, because in a democracy, negotiation is essential. You need to listen to different opinions. But when you're talking about the Morales organization as well as about the Maduro regime, political parties need to understand that they are not talking to equals. They are talking to organizations that are more akin to a criminal organization than they are to a political party. And that's something that in Bolivia was impossible. There was no time for Evo to try a mesa de diálogo. There was no time to call political leaders, because the two main leaders of the movement, Luis Fernando Camacho and Marco Pumari, were extremely young, and they are not connected in any way, shape, or form to any political structure. The type of democracy they were practicing was based in gatherings, town hall meetings, cabildos. So it was direct democracy. There was no chance to cause any kind of division. There was no opportunity to fracture civil society. And that's what caused Morales to end choosing a very dangerous path. You might think that he is out of the play. He is not. He did exactly this in 2003 when Morales and his organization, they overthrew a democratically elected government, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada administration. For those of you that don't remember that, Morales was sent to Libya to receive a prize from Muammar al-Gaddafi at the time. And during the time that he was out of the country, his movement basically unleashed terror in Bolivia and ended overthrowing this movement, which by the way was saluted as this revolution of the poor, the oppressed, the excluded, and the downtrodden, which was not. Mr. Morales is basically the leader of this organization. And this is another of the factors that actually help in this, I hope, definite demise, is the fact that his organization was unable to actually distribute the wealth produced by the illicit into the rest of the Bolivian society. Okay? We're talking about 60,000 families that have fared very, very well. When you look at the macroeconomics of Bolivia, you are going to see outstanding numbers. But inside of the country, poverty actually got worse, not better. Because in terms of the cost of living exploded. Now Bolivians have actually prices that are 5 times more expensive than the prices that they were paying when Morales came to office. So there is a lot of questioning from civil society, because if we had all this money, the largest amount of public reserves in Bolivian history, where did that money go? We have no better infrastructures. If you want two indicators, the most important should be healthcare and education. Healthcare is in shambles. Education is at its worst in Republican history. So I know that comparisons can be absolutely unfair. I respect the pain, the courage, the valor of the Venezuelan people. So I just hope that by describing what happened in Bolivia, certain hints could be taken and probably be used in order to deal with this situation. And now I'm going to go into the book very, very briefly. When we were presenting this book with the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, something really funny happened. By the way, it was not staged. We didn't plan for it. Mr. Diaz-Canel came into one of his infamous press conferences, and he said very adamantly, there is not a single Cuban military officer in Venezuela. The very next day we were presenting this book. And if you read this book, you are going to see a lot of very interesting facts that not only actually prove the presence of military personnel in Venezuela, but also prove how deep and how relevant that presence is. My colleagues have expressed how important it is to take into account foreign actors in Venezuela. We are dealing with that right now in Bolivia. If any of you think that the constitutional president, Janine Lopez, has a stable government, don't be confused. We are facing a lot of violence. A lot of this violence is coming from external actors. It is almost 100% certain right now that the snipers that were firing on the miners coming from Potosí to La Paz were actually foreign operatives. It's almost certain that the people who provided security for former Minister of Government Juan Ramon Quintana to flee the country were also foreign operatives. So we all have to deal with this. In Venezuela, probably the situation is worse because due to geopolitical and economic reasons, you are very interesting for countries like China, Iran, Russia. Due to the type of economic activity that Morales generated, basically illicit trade, we were probably more interesting to Cuba, Mexican cartels, irregular forces. But again, I think that if there's something to draw as a conclusion from this specific period of what some people have called the Bolivian Southern Wind, is that things can be achieved when you finally understand that you're not dealing with a political actor. Things can be achieved where negotiation is not possible when you are defending principle. Because once you regain democracy, the entire democratic game can start again. You can have elections, you can have political, I don't want to use the term bickering, but that only can be achieved once you have reinstated the rule of law and the real opportunity for democratic debate. If you try to do this right now, you are not talking to an equal. And I think that's part of the message coming from what happened in Bolivia.
Thank you so much to our three speakers, and I'm gonna dive into the Q&A part. And one of the main things, or one of the repeating things that I've seen in the questions is precisely the presence of Cuban and Russian influence in Venezuela. And we agree that Cuba is key in solving the situation in Venezuela. So one of the questions is, what should the U.S. foreign policy on Cuba be? And another one is, negotiation of Venezuela truly possible without constraining the Cuban or Russian influence? And how does the threat of Russian influence apply in Venezuela and, well, in Latin America in general, talking about Bolivia, the situation in Bolivia right now?
All right, I think that that's actually two questions into one. So I'm going to address the situation about Cuba. First and foremost, and this is the opinion of the board of the foundation, we think that Cuba must be called to answer about gross human rights violations, about specific activities. For example, parallel to this, the foundation was basically the first to uncover the true nature of the Cuban medical missions. We actually demonstrate with hard evidence that the myth of the Cuban medical mission as missions of solidarity and caring was actually a huge money-making machine based on modern slavery and human trafficking. And when we have to be very, very thankful to U.S. officials like Desde Washington D.C. to help exposing this to the world. But we also have to be very grateful for the actions of the Brazilian government, because when we presented that evidence, by then President-elect Jair Bolsonaro took a very courageous stand, and he said, no more, I'm not going to allow this. In financial terms, that's 50.1 of the total revenue the regime gets in terms of foreign currency. So that's a real hit. So the first thing I would do is to actually establish that as a fact. You cannot keep performing illegal activities in order to generate revenue. That's not a political issue. When we have exposed this here on the Hill, we have had widespread support from Republicans and Democrats, because we're talking about crimes, we are talking about human rights. When we're talking about Russia, that's very dangerous, because there is a report that has not been fully exposed yet on how, in the blatant, probably and parallel fraud that the Morales government attempted to steal the election, Secretary Almagro had defined that as the real coup. When certain media and certain actors are trying to whitewash this fraud, and they are speaking about a coup d'etat in Bolivia, where you don't have any of the elements to define a coup d'etat, and you have all the evidence to show that there was fraud there. There is one report that actually comes from Russia, from one dissident group, that is posing a very interesting, concerning hypothesis. They are saying that the outsourced server that intervened during the shutdown of the Bolivian electoral system was actually coming from Russia. If that's actually something that you can prove, right now that's just something that we're getting in this report, you're going to see how dangerous this is. And again, I have to refer to articles like the one penned by Sergei Shoigu, when he says, the new form of war is the war that we should privilege, because open confrontation with America would be suicidal. We need to weaken the Americans, defeating them through social war. We need to weaken their institutions. We need to create instability in the Western Hemisphere. And we realize what's going on in Venezuela and the type of actions that we have seen in Bolivia. You can see that that influence is there and it's very, very present.
Yes. Mark, any comments on the impact of Russian intelligence or the threat of Russian intelligence?
Yeah, let me actually take this from a little different angle.
Yeah.
Which is, I think it's important to take into account foreign influence, but I think it would be a mistake to exaggerate it. And I say this as someone who has been accused of being a CIA agent for 30 years now, starting in 1989 in Nicaragua, when I was working for the opposition to the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega. And if you go on Google and you Google Mark Feierstein CIA, there's a lot there. I've never worked with the CIA, I can assure you. But according to Granma and other publications, I did. And again, I say this also as someone who worked for Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada in his campaign in 2002 and worked with the opposition to Evo Morales for the last 20 years. And of course, the same in Venezuela, working with the opposition to Chavez. But where I'm going with this is, the fact is, it's important to understand the basis of support for Evo Morales, and what was the basis of support for Hugo Chavez. And the truth is, Evo Morales is a pretty popular figure still in Bolivia. He's probably the most popular political figure in Bolivia. If there had been a runoff, he might have won it. I lost it, but we were close. A runoff between Mesa and Evo would have been pretty close. And the truth is, Bolivia is an exceedingly polarized country, polarized regionally, polarized ethnically, polarized by class. And in La Paz and Cochabamba and Alto, Evo Morales has an awful lot of support. And I'm drawing now on polls. I worked for one of the opposition candidates to Evo during the election. And so I'm drawing now on polling I did and focus groups I did in La Paz and Santa Cruz and Cochabamba. And, you know, there is a real, first of all, the economy is doing fairly well in Bolivia. You know, poverty rates have declined dramatically. He's not destroyed the economy the way Maduro has. The Bolivian government has, you know, managed the economy fairly well. And large segments of the population are pretty content, and he gets, and Evo gets very high marks for empowering the indigenous. And the indigenous people in Bolivia are a majority. I think Evo's going to return someday. I don't think, I mean, I'm not suggesting it'll be like in 2 days, you know, as we saw with Chavez in 2002. But his political, I don't think his political career is over by any means. But I think it's important, again, to understand the basis for his support. And the same with Hugo Chavez. I mean, the fact is, Hugo Chavez at the time was really, really popular. He had 60% of approval ratings. Now, maybe that was in part because oil prices were particularly high, and he was able to create the misiones, but that's a fact. And you know, when I was doing focus groups in Venezuela, this was early Chavez years, and we would hear from people, even from people who didn't like Chavez, they would say, you know, for the first time we have a president who cares about the poor. Now, you may take issue with that, but the reality is that was the perception of a lot of people. And I think, you know, as we think about a resolution to the current crisis, and we think about, more important, building a sustainable democracy that incorporates all sectors, I do think it's important to understand the basis of support for people who are not democratic. Hugo Chavez was not a Democrat, obviously. And Evo Morales is an authoritarian figure, but there are reasons that they have a support that they did, and it's not externally driven, it's domestically driven.
Dan, your remarks?
Let me just add a couple comments here.
Okay.
First on Russia, because I think they're distinct, Russia and Cuba in this instance. I'll echo Ugo's comments about the Russian involvement in the cyber world and what's called social war or some other name. You know, there is at least some public reporting that suggests very active Russian presence throughout Latin America, Mexican elections. Some around the recent disturbances in Chile, for example, suggest some Russian fingerprints on some of the coordination that exists. To me, Russia, this is playing in Venezuela is like a cheap way to kind of stick it to us. It's why we need to continue as a matter of national policy, continue to make sure we're clear on our interest in Europe and Eurasia. This is a matter where we can project far more instruments, or far greater number of instruments of power and influence in their region, and I think that's really critical to this. At this point, it costs the Russians nothing to go through some of what really are symbolic actions, more than substantive ones in Venezuela. Cuba's different. Cuba has a stake in Venezuela going back to the early days of the Chavez government, some would say even before then. To some extent, there's indications that Havana is going to support at least some structure, Chavista structure, in Venezuela to the last Venezuelan. Basically the Cuban Revolution, let me be clear, the Castro Revolution has been built upon finding a sugar daddy. When the Soviets disappeared, they turned to the Venezuelans. And that continues to be important to them. I agree with Mark to the extent that we don't want to make the Cubans to be more than they are, but I think that we have a tendency in Washington, and I'll use my favorite George W. Bush expression, to misunderestimate the Cubans. We misestimate them repeatedly. I happen to think that they're one of the finest intelligence services in the world. They ran rings around our own CIA at one point. They know how to infiltrate governments, they know how to recruit, they know how to manipulate. And where do you see their presence in Venezuela? It's really in that monolith, that structure of the military in terms of maintaining discipline. There's enough defector reporting from Venezuelan military who now left the country defected, talking about the role of the Cubans in terms of maintaining that structure, which has become, within the military, at least the uniformed entities or services that exist in Venezuela, and how critical Cuba is to that. This is where I give the Trump administration very high marks in terms of its policy towards Cuba. For its administration, I will just say this, to kind of fully implement the letter and the spirit of the law, the Libertad Act, to put pressure on Havana in a way that it's not experienced before, Havana's not experienced before. There's this debate, does the road to Caracas lead through Havana, or does the road to Havana lead through Caracas? We'll flip a coin depending on the time. Right now the focus needs to be on Caracas, and continued pressure on the Cuban regime is important in that regard.
We only have a few minutes left, about 5 minutes, so another question that we got is, how do Venezuelans reconcile with the fact that the UN allowed a spot on the Human Rights Council, and how does it take place with the international pressure and the negotiations, and how does it work with all of the international pressure and negotiations that are happening right now around the world with towards Venezuela?
I'll take a stab at this, having dealt with the UN issue, again, from a policy-making role. First of all, I think people have to realize that New York is an alternative universe to the rest of the world. I say that somewhat facetiously but somewhat truthfully. To the extent that UN ambassadors ignore the instructions from their government is legend. And we've seen it all, again, over the series of actions and over years and over U.S. administrations. I know from the larger audience it's hard to reconcile. How can you have this international embrace of an interim government, Juan Guaido, a democratic Venezuela, and then see the UN turn around and vote as it did to seat Maduro's representative? I know that's kind of, again, one of those that doesn't make any sense if you're dealing in the logical world, but I just go back, what people have to understand, that it is a matter that there are rarely are there consequences for UN ambassadors for the vast majority of countries when they vote in the UN. We're really one of the few governments that really holds our own representative accountable and tries to have our interaction with foreign capitals actually get conveyed back to representatives in New York. I know that's a completely unsatisfactory answer, but from my experience, it is just the simple reality that quite often governments will let kind of a vote go in New York to placate, frankly, their own leftist constituencies. They will make a calculation, and we've seen this with Latin governments, European governments, you can pick any region of the world. You see that kind of trade-off at times. It's very frustrating for us because it's a sign of legitimacy for what is an illegitimate entity, the Maduro dictatorship. But at this point, I also think the whole UN human rights structure, with compliments to Michelle Bachelet and her report on Venezuela, I think that's something that needs to get more attention. Other than that, I think that structure is so corrupted, and it actually, at this point, makes human rights almost an oxymoron.
Bueno, yo amo a Nueva York, yo nací en Nueva York, la mejor ciudad del mundo. It's hideous and infuriating that Venezuela Human Rights Council is. But I think it's a sideshow. I think it's important to keep in mind that UN is different things. There's the UN General Assembly, there's the UN Security Council, and then there are various UN agencies. Refugee Commission, Human Rights Commission, that Bachelet runs, and I agree with that her reports have been really important. So I wouldn't get, again, it's infuriating, but there's a lot going on that's not going to upset. I'll tell you one UN story that coincides with with what Dan was saying, from the Obama administration, we were meeting with Dilma Rousseff. This was in June of 2016. And we were trying to make the case, President Obama wanted to make the case to the Brazilians that they should be more supportive of the United States in the UN, which has always been a real challenge. And he pointed out to President Rousseff how infrequently Brazil voted with the United States in the UN, and she was even surprised. I think it sort of speaks to your point about sort of the UN sort of and foreign ministry sort of do their own thing there. And then at one point, the Brazilian ambassador to Washington said, well, at least that's a higher number than India. President Obama said, well, that's a pretty low bar. So the UN is always going to be a challenge in different ways. But I think and I would say the same thing about the OAS, frankly. I mean, the OAS General Assembly has been a problem because the Caribbean bloc, which previously had been strongly supportive of democratic efforts and Bush administration, Clinton administration and such, has been a real problem with regard to Venezuela. But if you look at the OAS Human Rights Commission, if you look at Secretary General Almagro, I think you get a very different impression. So I think it's important to sort of make that distinction when we look at international bodies.
I would like to initiate this addressing something that was mentioned previously. There is something that needs to be acknowledged. Morales, as well as Chavez, they didn't come to power falling out of the blue sky. Okay, they were the result of exclusion, poverty, and a number of situations that you cannot deny. What made this Bolivian awakening so exceptional was the fact that the two main leaders were able to overcome some of those devices that were mentioned. Camacho from the lowlands, with, I would say, a providential ancestry. He is the great-grandfather of Eliodoro Camacho, who happens to be a hero on the highlands. That was also very surprising for the regime. They didn't know how to react. All of a sudden, they couldn't label him as this quote-unquote Rhodesian who was against the poor and the downtrodden because, hey, you know, the Avenida Camacho is actually named after the grandfather of this guy, so that was very difficult. On the other side, the other leader, Marcos Pumari, he's a real native Indian. He's not a mestizo like Morales, so how in the world could you delegitimize that? But again, it would be a huge mistake to make this a matter of political combat or revenge. We need to actually solve and address things that are still there. A friend of mine, I'm not going to disclose his name, always says the problem with you guys, he's talking about Latin America, is that the option is, it's always the MREs, and he's not talking about meals ready to eat. He says that, and he refers to morally repugnant elites. And that's a problem, so we need to address that. In terms of the international arena, it's something that's dangerous. Right now, again, in what's going on with this quote-unquote Bolivian awakening, Mexico, it's actually hinting to some troublesome developments. They are talking about Morales being the acting president because he intentionally didn't leave a formal letter of resignation. And the letter of resignation was not intentionally done as per the requirements of the Bolivian Constitution. And at the same time, they provoked a void. They made the vice president to resign, the president of Senate to resign, and the president of the Cámara de Diputados, basically the equivalent to the House. And that was intentional. It's also troublesome because we don't know what Alberto Fernandez is going to do coming December 10th, because he was the first person to recognize Morales as having won on that first round that now we all know was an absolute fraud. So what's going to happen in the UN? Who's going to be sitting representing Bolivia? To this day, there is no ambassador to the OAS, but there is an ambassador to the UN who has not resigned yet. So we might be facing a Guaido-like situation reversed, with one big difference. Morales do have a social base, which is very big in Bolivia, a very well-trained base in terms of rioting, military-like action, and stuff like that, and he has money. So international arena is something that you cannot just left to its own devices, because you can actually have everything that has been achieved to this day lost in a single day or a single session of the UN. So that's something to take into account.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today with our panel. I want to thank Mr. Dan Fisk, Mark Feierstein, and Acha for joining us today. We have a few questions that unfortunately couldn't be answered, but we'll do our best. To address them properly during the next panel or during any other moment. So thank you so much. No, we actually have another panel starting at 1:30. What?